Hello and welcome back to Women's Business Voice. My name is Angela D'Souza and I'm your host, and I'm going to be thrilled to hand over to my co-host in a minute, Dr. Amy Edwards from the University of Bristol, in this fantastic series that we've been exploring from side hustles to empires, history of working women's lives. This is a series where we're featuring conversations between Dr. Amy Edwards and a range of historians. The series as a whole explores the relationship between gender, work, and career in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, asking what's new and what isn't about the nature of working women's lives in Britain. The series explores not only the success stories of famous entrepreneurs and business leaders, but also hidden stories of women who made a living in systems and structures not often designed with them in mind. And so it's with great pleasure that we're going to be delving into this episode entitled Women of Innovation, Women Scientists, with Dr. Andrew Flack from the University of Bristol. And so without further ado, over to you, Amy.
Hi, welcome back for anyone who has listened to any others of these, or if this is your first and you've been drawn here by the presence of Dr. Andrew Flack, then welcome. But yeah, for our episode this week, we're going to be looking at the world of science, experiments, and discovery, I suppose. And I suppose it's worth saying that although we might not consider scientists like traditional entrepreneurs, or I think it's often a space that we don't often think of in terms of work, there's a lot about like scientific discovery that I think has overlaps with the world. Obviously, it is a job, but also has overlaps with how we think about entrepreneurs as people who are kind of innovators and creators and performing a role where they're kind of adding something new to the world. So yeah, I would say the other thing about science is it's often a world that we historically associate with men and the masculine. So to help us think about all of those things, scientific researchers' work, and to unpick the role of gender in that field, we're going to be joined today by my friend and colleague, Dr. Andrew Flack. And Andy, I should say, is an environmental historian. He studies the relationship between the human and non-human world, and maybe we can ask you a bit more about that in a second. But his current project and forthcoming book looks at the ways that naturalists, and I always double check that I say that right, naturalists discovered new ways of trying to kind of access and understand dark environments and the animals who inhabited them. So I think this came from a recent project that Andy was doing, which used histories of ability, of technology, emotion, scientific discovery to help us think about our understanding. Particularly, that project was about kind of disability and ability today and those categories. But yeah, the book anyway is called Dark Natures, Finding Life in the Shadows. I think it's coming out in about the next year or so. Is that right, Andy?
I hope so. Yep.
Yeah, great. We hope so. But yeah, Andy is going to be our resident expert in histories of science today. So thanks for joining us, Andy.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting about this kind of exciting area. I think that you're right, is often not thought about as work, but I think is very much has lots of parallels, I think, and also perhaps lots of the same sorts of barriers and challenges that might face women in other kind of areas of kind of work and labour.
Yeah, great. One of the things, before we kind of dive into some of that, one of the things I've been asking everyone, just because it's an interesting thing, I think, to get a sense of, is how you came to do the history that you do. Like, what made you interested in, well, what is it that you do also?
Yes, it's a good question. So I fell into what I do. It was an entire accident. In that, really, when I kind of did my undergraduate and master's work, I was interested in history of the empire and imperialism and that sort of thing. And it just so happened that on one occasion I discovered that maybe animals were an important part of that story. And so it went from there. My PhD project was on Bristol Zoo, and I was using Bristol Zoo to think about histories of captivity and what zoos can tell us about who we think we are and who we have thought we are, not only as human beings, but also as human beings in a particular place and time. And then I guess if I'm gonna tell a story that is logical, as part of that story, I became very interested in nocturnal houses and the kinds of creatures that were put on display there, and why they are almost always the strangest and most interesting places in zoos. And then that sowed the seeds for, well, actually, what does it mean? Like, what does darkness mean to us? How do we understand the creatures that live there? And I think that's really for me, that opens up a quite profound set of questions around how we use our senses, around our limitations, the limitations of our bodies, and how we adapt the world to suit ourselves at the expense of others.
Yeah, thanks. I always think it's so interesting as well about like a history that seems to be about one thing in the first instance ends up being about something entirely
Mm,
different, or that you can take a project like yours, which is on the one hand is about animals and the relationship between the human and non-human and what that can tell us about ourselves and our society and vice versa.
mm.
But also presumably, because that's what I've asked you to talk about today, has this whole strand which is also about a particular field or industry or like way of working or group of people in the form of scientists. So
Yeah.
would you say that are they your main kind of are they the people who appear most in your histories, or are there other groups as well? Can you tell us a bit more about what this looks like?
Yeah, so certainly in the project that I'm doing now, which is on dark places, the people that are there are the I don't know if you want to use the word, but they are explorers of dark places. They are inventors of strategies that allow them to go to those places, and they are practitioners of a particular kind of masculine science, as you pointed out at the beginning, which sometimes happens in the field, sometimes happens in laboratories, sometimes happens in both. Um, Admittedly, most of the people in my stories are men, but there are some women who kind of pop up, but they occupy a different space. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about. And I guess like that's connected much more broadly to my interest in the doers of science. So like I'm working on science in dark places, but actually I'm interested in how people have explored places, have thought about the world in which they live over many centuries. And there are some women there too that kind of pop up, often doing incredible work, often because they're forced into those positions, but then are very frequently ignored or not given the credit they deserve for lots of reasons.
Interesting. And I wonder, I definitely want to come back to that point, and I think maybe that's where we can most usefully talk about some of this stuff. Before we do, just for me, for anyone listening who's not super familiar with what it meant to work in science in, I guess, the late 19th into the early 20th, mid 20th century, what does it mean to work as a scientist back then versus how maybe we would think about working as a scientist today?
Yeah, it's a good question. Maybe we can extend this even back to the late 18th century, because I think
Please.
it's all part of the same sort of thing. So I would say that science fell in. It's a complicated story because what we tend to have today is people who are specialized in particular parts of science. The further we go back, the more we find people who just do science and they do history and they write novels or whatever. They do all sorts of things, right? So they're kind of polymaths. Um, but what we find also is that there's a very clear and small professional community. They are the people who work in the universities. They are, for most of our period, men, always men, usually very well, of course, are very well educated men, but also rich and well connected men. But then you have the much bigger field of amateur science, which is not professionalized, doesn't take place necessarily in universities, but anyone can do it in theory. That's where you tend to find women for most of our period. They're the ones who are doing lots of really interesting stuff in that amateur domain, where they can go out into the local areas, for instance, doing natural history. They are not supported by institutions. They are not often paid to do this, but they're nevertheless working really hard to do that. What you find, I guess, once we get maybe like 60s, 70s onwards, is that the field of professional science expands much more significantly. You start to get more and more women coming into those roles because education opportunities have opened up and other social barriers have started to become a little more permeable. But that doesn't mean we've got a reduction of the amateur. The amateur's still massive. So what you get is that you get perhaps more women in both kind of fields of scientific work.
Interesting. So is it fair to say that that's a story that we might describe as women being at the like being forced in many ways to work at the margins, and maybe that producing then really interesting work that they might do because, as you said, they're not in the kind of mainstream
Mhm.
spaces, but that over time they are also invited into the kind of center or the mainstream of the scientific discipline, the kind of
Mhm.
the industry. I don't know if we would want to call it an industry by
Mhm.
that point, but yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, more and more, though certainly not equally represented, but you
Right.
get more. Yeah, yeah, definitely.
And so I wonder, Andy, if from your research, as you say, you've focused more on particularly the doers of science who are doing science in dark places and looking at the creatures who are in those places. Are there any women who jump out from your research? I know you said that a lot of the characters who you encounter are men, but are there any women who did that kind of science?
Mm. The amateur kind of science.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And maybe I'm going to draw on maybe two examples.
Hmm.
One is from outside the kind of dark nature, and then one is very much in it. But I think there are some quite interesting parallels across almost 200 years, which I think is really interesting. So the first one is Mary Anning. Mary Anning is a super interesting individual and very well known. She was born at the end of the 18th century. She worked down at Lyme Regis. She, for a long time as a child, helped her dad. Her dad collected fossils and then sold them. Now, her dad died when she was 11. So, in order to provide for her family, she took on the fossil finding business, if you like. They're being sold to tourists, these fossils. As part of that work, then, over the years that followed, she discovered some of the first large dinosaur skeletons, discovered brand new species, but she was a woman and she was not in a professional institution and she was not allowed to publish her work. So she was never acknowledged for doing any of that really important foundational work. It's only in hindsight that we've been able to look and acknowledge her role in that story, which for a long time, the story of dinosaur discovery in Britain is the story of a few particular men working in research institutions like the Natural History Museum in London. Now, if you come into the 1980s, there is another woman who's wandering around in parts of Britain, but she's doing so in the dark. She goes out. Her name is Chris Ferris, by the way, but that's not her name. So this is a pseudonym that she has taken for reasons that I'll come back to. And she's wandering around every night, basically, over between 5 and 10 years. So she becomes nocturnal. She, when she's doing that work, she's watching creatures that live in her local area. And she produces all sorts of brand new insights around badgers and foxes and owls in particular. But again, the men who were working in the institutions who were also interested in that sort of thing looked at her and said, well, you're not professional. You are not publishing this stuff. This is not real science. And so her work has never been cited in academic papers. It exists only in the form of her kind of informal writings. Now, one of the reasons that she chose to change her name, I still haven't worked out who this person is. And I really I'd love to, but there are good reasons why I think. First of all, to protect the creatures that she was looking at from anyone who was into badger baiting, poaching, any of that sort of stuff, from working out who this person is, where she walked, and therefore where they could go to find prey. But also because, and she writes about this in her memoirs, as a woman, she felt vulnerable being out in the dark, not because of the animals that were there, but because of potential encounters with men in dark places. So I think that if you take the two stories together, you have a wide range of barriers to participation in professional science, despite the fact that both women are doing groundbreaking science in their own way and undertaking labor in their own way. And I think that it's quite humbling to look at those and think, well, actually, over 200 years, there's something that connects these two experiences of marginalization. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's interesting. I think I hadn't thought before. It was only hearing you talk then that it made me think that, yes, of course, the type of science you do is really important. I'm saying type of science. Look at me, a historian, pretending I know about types of science. But yeah, your field of research or the type of research or the conditions, whether that's in a lab, whether that's out in the field. I mean, that there are other barriers or kind of gendered experiences that we know about and we think of in lots of other contexts that, of course, also become relevant. One of them being out at night on your own as a woman, and that there are then also places. It's not just an industry or a particular work environment. It is in like a kind of business that might feel that it is kind of pushing women out, but it also might be that the very nature of the work itself is seen as not suitable for women, or that women experience it as not particularly safe or not particularly welcoming. Is that kind of fair to say?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly true. And again, you can find examples of that everywhere. So if you were to, I reckon, if you were to come up with a list of the greatest female scientists of the past 200 years, you would probably find, number one, reluctance within the wider family for a woman to go into science, or indeed to go into education to the level that's required to do professional science. Second of all, problems getting in to an institution that would educate them. So there are loads of examples. I think Rosalind Franklin that's one of the people who discovered DNA. Eventually got into a university, but was marginalized by her male counterparts. And then you would have, if someone was able even to get into a university setting or a professional science setting, all those assumptions around femininity, around the masculinity of science, that science is not a subject for a soft woman, right? I'm using inverted commas there, just for the audio. So I mean, I think Rosalind Franklin is a really good example of that, because she was the first to discover the shape of DNA in the middle of the 20th century. But there were two men working with her who stole her notes and then went on to destroy her career, essentially, by publishing about her in really derogatory ways. They won a Nobel Prize. She did not.
It's quite incredible when you hear these stories, and I mean, I guess some are more famous now, like you say, Mary Anning. I had heard of, not least because there was a film made about her not so long ago, with Kate Winslet in. Is that the one?
Yes, correct.
But
Yeah.
yeah. But then so many of it's still kind of astounding to hear quite how difficult it could be based purely on gender for someone to I guess for brilliant minds to do their thing and to kind of add to our knowledge of the world around us. Yeah, that's, I guess, quite humbling, I think, to hear about. I wondered if, in addition to the kind of big names who are the kind of women who, even if only retrospectively, we would now recognize as making huge discoveries, what kind of work would women have been able to do in relation to science? I know you noted, there are like laboratories and all of those bits. Are there any other spaces where women find careers, even if that career isn't as quote unquote scientist?
Yeah, so I mean, often they would take on supporting roles within kind of scientific laboratories or research stations. So you will find that, for example, in the field of oceanography, so the study of deep sea life, it was the men who went down and did the scientific work, and they may report their findings up to the women who'd be taking the notes and scribing and recording the information that's being discovered through the eyes of the men. So the New York Zoological Society sponsored several expeditions in the 1930s and 40s, undertaken by William Beebe and another who I can't remember. Anyway, and yes, there was a particular individual whose name I also can't remember. Oh dear. Who was supportive there? But the same was true, I think, if you look in zoological societies too, where it's only quite recently that women have taken on the role of animal keepers. An animal keeper is really a scientist on the ground. But for a long time, it was a male domain. Most animal science was a male domain. The women were much more kind of in the bureaucracies. You know, there was the receptionist, the secretary, the ones who were there supporting the work on the ground.
That's so interesting because I guess in other spaces, when we think about the kind of roles that women have historically been encouraged to take on in terms of work, they have often been care work. And I suppose
Mm,
on the one hand, there's like caring for animals, but so that's kind of interesting as well, I suppose, gives us an insight into how people thought about the animals. My best guess would be is that because it was perceived as like dangerous work, working
yes.
with exotic and wild animals, or is it a high status
Mm.
work? What's the gen? Why is it kind of gendered in that way, do you think?
I think um, I think certainly because there is a sense that it's dangerous. So certainly in terms of working with the big animals, there's that. It's also potentially high stakes work because these animals were fragile, often very valuable commodities, and so had to be looked after properly by people who had the knowledge to do so. And so there was this sense that actually it's the men that were doing that work. There are some really interesting examples where women are leading on that. So in Australia, I mean, if anyone wanted to do some further reading, there's a great PhD student in Australia at the moment doing some work on kind of female naturalists. Her name is Ruby Eckel, so I would go and look her up. I don't want to speak for her, but she's doing some really interesting work on kind of examples when women are kind of taking over that work. But certainly, I think from my understanding of the work she's done, that's in situations where actually the caring element was elevated and
Right.
became much more important.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting across, I guess, some of the different folks I've been talking to as part of this, thinking about what kind of work is like gendered as feminine, what kind of work is gendered as masculine, and the ways that that has kept people out, or that women have had to really push in the ways that you're describing some of the characters that you've encountered, really have to
Mm,
push to kind of find a seat at have a seat at the table, or whatever the phrase is.
mm.
But I wonder, Andy, really just to round off, if you had any thoughts about where that leaves us today, or what we might learn from these histories of science's work, science as a space where some people are invited in, some people are not, as a space that's divided between professional and amateur. Like,
Mm,
what does that look like today? Are we much further on from that?
mm. I think in some senses we are. I think there is my understanding of the natural sciences today is that there's a much greater recognition that that amateur work has value. So that then opens up the doing of science to a much wider demographic. That being said, I do still think it's true. If you look within any discipline, that's not only the sciences but also our own, it is still predominantly the automatic people who get referenced or cited are men of a particular age, often, or of particular status. So I think there is still a huge amount of work to do to recognize the contribution that women make to the sciences very broadly conceived. And one way, or kind of one set of initiatives that I think is really interesting is in the American Society for Environmental History, who have a flip the list initiative at the moment, which is kind of taking the canon, which is like the established list of works and scholars who've produced all the most important stuff in inverted commas, and then posing the challenge. What if we rethink that list? What if we actively look to bring in kind of people of other genders, ethnicities, abilities, whatever it might be, and come up with like a list of authorities on a subject that is much more diverse. So I think we can continue doing stuff like that to really recognize the different contributions that are coming kind of within the scientific disciplines.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, like you said, this is partly a question about like science as a
Mm,
academic discipline, science as a workplace. But the moment you start thinking about academic disciplines, this is also true of kind of academic research, no matter the discipline. And I think that's certainly a really valuable way of thinking about the importance of who we reference and who we cite, both in formal academic senses, but also in our general life. Like if our touch points are, if we can be a bit more creative about who our touch points are when we want to invoke expertise or authority on a subject, are we really thinking kind of broadly about all the different voices who have helped us to better understand whatever that might be, whether that's history, whether that's animals who roam around in the dark, whether that's, I don't know, robots. Again, that's a historian, I've immediately run out of areas of science. But yeah, I guess that pretty much leads me just to round up and say thank you so much for your time, Andy, and for explaining to us a bit about the history that you do, and also what that history can tell us about gender and work in an area that I really didn't know actually much about. So I really appreciate it.
Brilliant. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks.
Cheers.
Thank you for joining us on Women's Business Voice, where women rise, lead, and make an impact. If you loved today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a woman who needs to hear this. Want more inspiration? Visit womensbusiness.club to connect, grow, and be seen. Until next time, keep showing up powerfully. The world needs what only you can bring.